want to welcome everyone to this special lecture of LACIS, the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies Program. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Eduardo Santana, who almost doesn't need an introduction here, but yeah, he's an alum of UW-Madison. And he's an adjunct professor, and now he's a researcher and professor at the University of Guadalajara. He's here with us to give us an update of the project of the Museum of Environmental Sciences, Museo de Ciencias Ambientales de Guadalajara. And I want to extend my warm welcome to Eduardo. Thank you for being with us, Eduardo.
Thank you so much, Alberto, for inviting me, and thank you for coming. And I'm gonna give a general context of the description of the museum at the beginning, but the new lines of work and the evolution of the thinking, which in essence, I'll go to the end of the talk. In essence, the narrative of the museum is going in the direction of health and in the direction of human rights, much more than it was when we first designed the museum in 2009, so 13 years ago. So I'll go quickly, and I'll recognize that Juan Nepote and Abril Ambris, they helped me put this talk together. So just some ideas with regards to the context for designing the museum from the start is that we were asked to design a natural history museum about life in the future. And that in a way was a paradox, because history is about events of the past, not the future. We are constructing a future that is incompatible with life. And so the concept that unites all of this is extinction. It links, it ends life, it obliterates the past, and it impedes transcending into the future. So that was one of the aspects that we worked on. The other is a quote. I'll start with a quote. This is the paradox. No period in history has been more penetrated by or more dependent on natural sciences than the 20th century, yet no period since Galileo's recantation has been less at ease with it. And that is a reality that I think we see today. And the last one is an old quote from Aldo Leopold, that the standard paradox of the 20th century is that our tools are better than we are, grow better and faster than we do. They suffice to crack the atom, to command the tides, maybe to get to the moon and to Mars, but they do not suffice for the oldest task in human history, to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. And what's strange about this museum is that it doesn't use a museum as a model. It used a biosphere reserve with a concept of development, of conservation, and of education and research linked to both development, social development, and conservation. And that is unique. And the other one is that it is linked to an institution that we got we were inspired by, an academic institution that, unlike most academic departments and universities that are thematically or disciplinary, zoology, mathematics, history, this was a department created to create a biosphere reserve and help manage the territory. So when you're problem-based in your organization, you are trans or multidisciplinary in how you approach it from the start. So it's not a discipline that defines you as an institution, it's a problem that is place-based, and that was different. And we did a lot in that project 30 years ago. Environmental education, working mostly in rural communities. And we worked with different government agencies and different stakeholders. In this case, what we're showing is managing the watershed in a river. And we were doing social experiments. In essence, with the recycling program, what you're seeing in this picture is a cooperative of indigenous women up in the right. That was what we worked on a recycling program in Zapotitlán de Vadillo. In the lower right, it's a private entrepreneur that worked on the program, and on the left, it was a municipality. Well, the woman cooperative failed, the private citizen failed, and the municipal government worked, and it's now the oldest one in Mexico. There were others before, but there was no continuity. So this is now the oldest municipal recycling program in Mexico, there in El Grullo, linked to the reserve. So the process that we lived and that we use as a model for the museum is that we started working in a scientific station. I showed some pictures of corn, where wild corn was discovered by a student from the University of Guadalajara and a professor from the University of Wisconsin, Hugh Iltis, and John Dobley, who's Iltis passed away. Dobley is here at the University of Wisconsin again. He was co-author of a paper in Science describing it. But so from that scientific station, the project grew to 140,000 hectares on a biosphere reserve. And then, because of the problems outside of the reserve were affecting what happened inside in the river, we needed to take a watershed perspective. It grew outside of the boundaries of the protected area in working with 10 different municipalities in the watershed of the Ayuquila River. And from there, it grew to a model of intermunicipal management of watersheds and solid waste in the whole state of Jalisco. It now covers the whole state of Jalisco. And it is a mechanism that reduces corruption because it's intermunicipal, thus many different parties. And you have stakeholders in the decision-making table with regards to decision-making and contracts and things like that. And then it grew with funding from the European Union for intermunicipal models in other states of Mexico. Finally, this project, you can see the title of a paper. It was published. It was used by the United Nations as a model on collaborative governance for sustainable water use and water management of resources. Now, that experience we're bringing from the rural context to the urban context. And this is the city of Guadalajara, and shows how it grew from 1980 to 2015. It is still around 5 million people. And within the city, the University of Guadalajara, which is a public university with over 300,000 students, is one of the largest in the hemisphere, has land, which is what you see colored there, and the city grew around it. And there it has 2 university campuses. It's going to have a 3rd campus now on arts and music. And it also began a cultural center. And this is a picture of the cultural center, a render. It has a public library, which is the 2nd largest in Mexico in number of books and square meters. It's got a performing arts center similar to the Lincoln Center, with one of the best acoustics in Latin America, according to Placido Domingo. A cineteca, a cinetech for movies. It has an auditorium, and the museum is in a center. And the other land around, the university hopes to develop with a public and private investment in apartment buildings, shopping center, hotels, corporate offices, and the funds that are generated from those other area investments around the cultural center then is used to run both things that don't make money, opera and theater and the library and museums, as well as finance educational programs. Now, based on the environmental science museum concepts that were developed with regards to sustainability and sustainable urban use, this area then is now part of a bigger project that is a district, an urban cultural district that goes beyond the university lands and provided a model that was approved by the federal government in the past administration for vertical, intensive, and mixed use of the land, with a series of criteria on sustainable and integral use of water, energy, solid waste, communication, that any investment in housing in this area had to cover all these things to get federal finance. And linked to that was funding for the improvement of homes of people that already live in the area. This ultimately, although it was approved, it was a 4-year process. There was a change in the federal government 3 years ago, and these sustainable urban development projects were stopped by the federal government. And there is awareness that the university has to look to ways for something like this not to be created, which in essence is increasing inequity in the area. And here, this is a picture from Brazil, where some people don't have water on one side of the wall and the other people have swimming pools in their terraces. So the concept of how we were developing the museum is similar, as I mentioned, to the one of the Biosphere Reserve. In that case, we had a biological research station that catalyzed projects. And in this case, the museum is the entity that catalyzes project. It grows in the territory that I showed on the screen. In this case, it then grew to the intermunicipal watershed management area. And in our case, now in the city, it grows to the urban district, cultural district of the city of Zapopan in the Guadalajara metropolitan area. So in essence, it's always institutions linked to territory, the model, and growing from small, slowly getting bigger. Now, one of the aspects that we look at the museum scientific narrative are the objectives or goals of sustainable development, UdeGs in Spanish. And although they're always shown like this as a grid, because it's an environmental science museum, we look at it another way. In essence, is that the goals that have to do with the environment are the basis for society then to work on, and whatever society works on and defines, in essence, ethics, morals, laws, then runs the economy and the market. The market never gives you direction. The market can be a very good tool, but it doesn't provide direction. If you use market rules, we could be selling livers for transplant, or we could be selling hearts. But ethics and morals does not allow us to be killing people to sell livers and hearts for transplants. So there is a hierarchy with regards to how we deal with that. Now, when we started looking at how we designed this new museum, we had to see that we're not in a situation of the museums of the 19th century, of natural history museums of the 19th century. It's a different world now, and we had to look at different things. So organizing museums, for example, what's normal, natural history museum is by taxonomy, invertebrates, vertebrates, mammals, etc. Or biomes, where you have the dioramas and you have the savanna biome, you have the desert biome, you have the tundra, the temperate forest, the coniferous forest. Well, that also is no longer a true picture of reality, because in essence, 80% of the world's terrestrial area has already been modified by humans. We have new anthropogenic biomes that didn't exist before. And although we need that baseline work of nature, we have to analyze nature as it is now and not just how it used to be in the past. So that was one aspect that was important. The other one linked for that is what's called the Anthropocene, that we're not going to be, there are arguments whether it's an epoch, it's a geological era, maybe it's a geological event. That is for sure, because already the world has a layer that's totally different from what was there before. If we had a paleontologist come from another universe, or a geologist, and there was no humans on Earth anymore, they would find that something happened as of the 1950s that changed that layer of the planet Earth. There's a layer of aluminum that didn't exist before, a layer of plastic that didn't exist before, a layer of radioactive materials that didn't exist before. There's a layer of chicken bones that have fossilized that didn't exist before because we've made chickens the most abundant bird in the planet. So that is the essence of where we live. And the other thing is that all these changes have to do with the increase in human populations that you can see there in red. But as of 2007, for the first time in the history of mankind, humankind, most people live in cities. And that's the bottom graph that shows how urban population increased above rural population as of that time. And that had never happened before. And cities consume most of the energy, produce most of the greenhouse gases that cause global climate change, generate much of the GNP, and it's where most people are going to suffer because of climate change and the loss of ecosystem services. And cities are where political power, economic power, military power, scientific power is found. There is a difference. I know that the Harvard Urban Lab says that it's no longer relevant to talk about urban, rural, and wilderness dichotomies. But the fact is that they are different regardless of how much they're interacting amongst themselves more and more. And it makes sense, I think, even in terms of conservation of wildlife and analyzing pollution, to make those distinctions between those three land use intensities. And powerful urbanites will define the future of the countryside, will define the future of nature, of wilderness. But the urbanites are the ones that are more ignorant about their dependence of nature to survive. And so we decided that we needed, in a new museum in the urban Anthropocene, we had to have a nature museum that was mostly focused on urbanites that will change the world. And in the city, we know already that there's evolution going on in cities. There's genetic changes in populations of wildlife, of vertebrates, of rats, of mice, of birds, etc. That's been found, but still, I think when we look at human evolution in the 300,000 years where our species has existed, the modern city is less than 0.02% of our existence. We have not evolved in cities. We are evolving in cities. We've created this new habitat, but still, the great civilizational challenge is how urbanites are going to adapt both to the city and to those landscapes that are supporting the city. And in essence, this brings me to the importance of cities that we just lived. We just saw the problem with the pandemic change and the importance of the environment and ecology on human health. And so I just want to mention two things here that the Harvard, the Chan Institute in Harvard did an analysis recently of how to prevent pandemics. And it's interesting that it was not medical, it's better surveillance, better management of wildlife, and reduction of deforestation. So that's what the public health experts say we need to do to stop pandemics. And all three of them have to do with ecology, even the surveillance one, which is traditional epidemiology. And the other thing that happened was that medical journals, for the first time in the world in their history, over 200 journals published the same editorial saying that climate change was the greatest threat to public health. So now, more than ever, we have this understanding and linkage. It was always known, but maybe now it's more known by politicians, between environment and public health and all the deaths that are caused, for example, for air pollution that that bring about, in addition to suffering, the economic and the political instability that like the COVID-19 did. So the museum ultimately we came to the conclusion that its mission, its purpose, what drives its work is understanding the city and inspiring the conservation of nature that sustains it. And that's understanding complex systems thinking, the city as a system with subsystems that determine its functioning, and it's part of a super system that not only determines an ecological footprint, but ultimately determines whether it's going to collapse or it's not going to collapse, like other civilizations have collapsed in the past. We then began to do the analysis and how we were going to interpret this and explore it with both our students, researchers, and the public, which includes the neighbors. And we decided to do the zoning of the museum by landscapes, not by biomes, not by ecosystems. Biomes are defined by latitude, altitude, evapotranspiration, rainfall, temperature. Ecosystems are defined by energy flow or nutrient cycling. But landscapes are in essence the cultural use of the natural substrate. So landscapes forces you, biomes and ecosystems, you don't have to even mention humans. Humans are not relevant to the definition of biomes or ecosystems. You can't talk about landscapes without the human presence shaping the land. So that's why we use landscapes, urban landscape, rural landscape, and wilderness landscape in mountains, lakes, coast, and arid highlands, which is what we find in Western Mexico, in Guadalajara, as Alberto said, the university in Jalisco, where I am. So as an institution from the start, and the challenge is that this doesn't stay just as wishful thinking. Based on the previous Biosphere Reserve model that I mentioned, MCA means Museum of Environmental Sciences, is 5 institutions and 3 different museums in one, in essence. So first is public green space, over 2 hectares of natural gardens that were defined in workshops with the neighbors. It is a high school. It has laboratories of physics, chemistry, classrooms, auditorium. It is a community development center working with the neighbors. And it is a research institute on urban sustainability. And that's how it's being worked as an institution. As a museum with the exhibits, it's the Natural History Museum that was requested. It is also within the form of an interactive science center. And because it is linked to the culture of Western Mexico, the history of Western Mexico, it is also an anthropology and history museum as such. Now, the institution is designed with the 4 major substantive functions of the University of Guadalajara: teaching, communication, research, and outreach, formal education and non-formal education and teaching, scientific communication and cultural communication, and in research, basically urban, rural, and wilderness linkages, the sustainable urban development, and learning perspectives and public perception. So those are the 3 main lines of research. And in outreach is both within the university system, outside of the university, in government, society, private sectors, and primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors of production and community development. Now, the museum part are these 2 things that I'm showing you here. In essence, that's the part of the exhibits of non-formal education and scientific. And then we have innovation, internationalization, and sustainability as across the transverse line. Now, there's a work plan. I'm not going to go into it. Each of those boxes flares out into 3 to 6 other activities in the area. And this is how we designed the museum. And I'm just going to do this quickly because this is as a process of working with different architects. And we are proud that there was an article published on this, and it wasn't about architecture of the museum. It was about the process that we used. And that is a legacy that remains. This was done 10 years ago, well, 12, in 2010. And the architects, based on this narrative, went to the central of the city, the central part of the city of Guadalajara, went to the buildings built in the colonial era by the Spaniards, which is in essence Arab science and technology that came in through the Spaniards, and took iconic buildings. One of them on the right is a World Heritage Site. And but they recognize that nature imposes limits, which is something that sometimes physics students know that, but economists think that there can be perpetual growth, as if there could be perpetual motion, and that's not really the case. So we know there are limits, and they recognize the limits of Guadalajara, which is that ravine in the northern part of the city that you see there. And so they do it an abstraction of the colonial building. They put complexity of the yards, of the indoor yards. They let water conceptually run over the concrete like it did over 5 million years in that ravine, in that river. And then that shaped the concrete like it shapes the rock. So they took the city on the left, nature on the right, and they did the applying the conceptual erosion and generated this model. Snøhetta was the architecture firm. And then they're from Oslo, but we needed shade in the rooftop. So we ended up with what's probably going to be the most biodiverse garden, rooftop garden in Latin America. And it's got shade with solar panels. And so that's the building. The building itself is an exhibit. It's LEED certified. And then the inside of the building, we divided it this way. In Western Mexico, wonderful place of confluences. The visitor passes to the urban area, then to the rural area, the campo. And then it's not linear. You can go to the different galleries, the mountain, the arid highlands, the lakes and rivers on the coast. And the last landscape is conceptual, is the landscape of hope. It is ordinary people doing extraordinary things and successfully. It's to create hope, not to create despair, changing things for the better and for themselves and for the environment. Now, there are routes of explorations that we've designed with high school teachers on climate change, energy, water, human rights, soils, sustainable urbanism, and the focus has been interdisciplinary. So this is how it looks on the map, and when you go in, you go into a natural history museum, but you don't see nature. What you see is only steel, glass, and flashing lights. It's the city, and then the green part around the city is the rural area, the countryside that produces food for the city. And then you go to the coast, you pass through the countryside to go to the lakes and river, to go to the arid highlands, or to go to the mountains. Now, William Cronin, that tomorrow there's going to be a seminar in his honor, he came down to help us tell stories. And when we told him that we were looking at what moves between landscapes, like any systems, you have, well, there's only three things that moves between landscapes: matter, energy, and information. From my body to this room, the exchange is matter, energy, and information. From this room to the rest of the building, from the building to the city of Madison, from the city of Madison to Dane County, only three things move: matter, energy, and information. And of course, people move, right? But we are little bags of water, in essence. Half of us is water. And we move we carry the water with us because we came from the ocean. And but we also have spirit and soul. Now, we don't know whether the spirit is on the left lung and the soul is on the right foot, but that doesn't matter. The essence is that is what moves the world, and that is what moves people. In essence, are those values. liberty, patriotism, human rights that we've created. And so we put that into the formula. So Cronin helped us discuss, well, what, you studied in Wisconsin, Eduardo, what killed the passenger pigeon? And I learned in my class here, the telegraph and the train. And that's exchange of what? Information in the telegram, movement of matter in the train, which were the carcasses of passenger pigeons that were salted to the markets in the city. So we have a highway going to the coast from the city. We have a train railroad going to the highlands. The Mexican Revolution was fought mostly along railroad lines. And we have a recua de mula, a mule train, a bunch of mules going up into the mountain to link the landscapes and explore the exchange of matter, energy, information between these landscapes. And there are no walls because there's no walls in nature, but the visitor knows where they are by color, shape, patterns, sound, landscapes, forms. And so the city is a tapestry of different kinds of interwoven cables, roads, etc., that you can see here. And then that starts, it's mostly a grid like the original Spanish grid of the city. But then it starts getting distorted as you move into the mountains or along the rivers, etc. And that's how the design follows in this museum. So these are just quickly some examples of what we designed. This is the urban kaleidoscope, where you explore the systems of and subsystems within the city and screens, the countryside and the technology in the countryside, the living soil that provides not just food, but ecosystem services that are important. This is the highlands of Western Mexico with the train that I mentioned and the history of Western Mexico. The cloud forest, which is a live forest with a waterfall coming out of the building. Lakes and rivers and the study of watersheds. With the University of Michoacan, we've designed, I'll tell you at the end, but we got our budget cut, but we've designed a program for reproduction and restoration of endemic fishes in Western Mexico that are endangered. The coast area, the mangroves on the coast, the ocean. And we also have, and that's what we show here in those red rectangles, these are all strictly traditional classroom areas, laboratories, workshops, makers lab, auditorium, theater, that we designed with high school teachers for the classes, so that the schools that do not have the resources can come to the museum and use resources that they can all have, but they can share them when they come to the museum. And we have dialogue spaces, which we consider one of the most important parts of the museum for both face-to-face in-person dialogue or dialogues between landscapes by different groups with their teachers. Now, I mentioned that it was also a community development lab, the museum, and that for us is important. We did an analysis. What you see here is the area of highest poverty, which is just 3 kilometers away from the museum. But also we have the areas of the richest people in Guadalajara living also on the other side of the museum. So we're in a transition zone, and the Zapopan, the municipality of Zapopan, is always between the 3 municipalities in Mexico that has the highest index of inequity. The richest people in Mexico don't live here, nor the poorest, but it's where there's more difference between rich and poor within the boundaries of one municipality. And we did analysis and we began work with the University of Wisconsin on looking at the linkages, the landscapes, social landscapes and natural landscapes around the museum. And that's an ongoing project that we began, and it's been slow because we haven't been able to raise all the funds for the work, but it hasn't, but it's generated some good results so far. And we did analysis in different neighborhoods with the UN Habitat program of the United Nations in Zapopan about what the neighbors considered were the major problems. These workshops were the ones that neighbors said that they wanted safe urban spaces, public spaces, and that had shade. They also say they didn't have trash, and that had vegetation, and that's what we designed around the museum. These are the different municipalities we work with, and we did research on, and we generated the sustainability recommendations for urban development for the whole metropolitan area. The museum coordinated 40 different researchers from 4 different universities. Meanwhile, in 2009, which is when we started the design, we started the Socio-Environmental Film Festival, and that has grown and will grow. I can't announce it yet, but I will announce it in a couple of weeks. Some new exciting aspects about this film festival that began in 2009. It's the oldest in Mexico, with another in Guadalajara. Again, wasn't the first one, but the first ones did not continue. And so this is it's going to be 14 years. And we signed an agreement with the other old film festival in Cuernavaca, Cinema Planeta. And now, in essence, we made 4 weeks ago, we made access to 8 different documentaries, and we designed with high school teachers 20 pedagogical guidelines for studying the different documentaries linked to the curricula in the high school classes. So we're hoping this year to have 180,000 students. This is online. And for 2 of them, we have an analysis of the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal, a manual for the teachers to use on the documentaries. So the impact is now nationwide of what we began with the local film festival. And we started a poetry and short story competition on nature and city relations. And why is an environmental science museum talking about poetry? Well, we use Wagensberg, Jorge Wagensberg, who was the director of the Cosmocache in Barcelona, Spain, analysis of how humans acquire and generate knowledge. And he says there are many models for this, but I like his. He says there are, in essence, 3 ways: the scientific method, the artistic method, and the revealed or spiritual method. So if a problem is very simple, you use science. If the problem is very difficult, you can only approach it through art. And if the problem is impossible, then you look for deities to be telling you stuff, which is a way of inspiration. So we explore the city-nature relationships that way, both from the different sciences, from music, art, poetry, and from the cosmovision of different cultures of what the relations of human and nature were conceived and generated in different contexts and continents in different areas. So that's why we have the Poetry Award. And I'm happy to say, the 4W program here at the University of Wisconsin in the School of Human Ecology with Sarli Mercado and Lori Dupree began a translation and process, and it's a communal translation, which is not just one individual translating, but many individuals communicating and generating something new linked to the authors of the winning books. And that hopefully is going to be shown at the Guadalajara International Book Fair, which is the largest in the Romance languages in the world and the 2nd largest in the world. And with Meninas Cartoneras, with the cardboard boxes, books that began in Argentina during the time of great poverty. And we began working in community development, even if while the museum was being built. And we did a street art competition. I'm just showing you, those were all the people, all the communities that suggested that apply, all those different yellow pins in the map. The museum is inside the circle. And this is what they did. These were the murals that are now painted. They're in the street. They haven't been, they don't have graffiti on them. And they were linked with artists to generate, we asked them what were the social environmental problems of the community that they could put. And so these are, you can see the walls, these are like 30 feet long by 7 feet high. These murals that are, and now we're going to do a second share of the mural. And we're starting now a digital outreach called Chronicles of the Anthropocene, which has a blog and op-ed that we'll be doing weekly in the newspaper and radio show, and working with the Human Rights Commission on the problems that people are coming or we know about in social environmental problems, and doing analysis and studies of how environmental problems are not really environmental problems. They're social problems that have environmental repercussions are affecting people, especially underprivileged people. And so we've been doing that, and then bam, all of a sudden, there's a fight between the governor of the state of Jalisco and key people at the University of Guadalajara. And the museum had been built, which between 150 million pesos a year to about 400 million pesos a year. And then the Congress of the state of Jalisco had appropriated 140 million for this year, for last year. And the governor said, I'm not giving it to the university. It doesn't have to do with the museum. It's a political fight that has to do with other things. It has to do with different fighting about how to deal with the COVID pandemic. They work very well. We were one of the best states in controlling the pandemic. We saved many lives. The University of Guadalajara has the second largest hospital in Latin America, and like 4 medical schools. And they calculated that if the federal government had done what we did in Guadalajara, there would have at least been 170,000 people that would not have died in Mexico had they done and followed the health table analysis that the university had in the state. But anyway, they got into a fight, so it didn't continue. There were fights about human rights. The governor decided to flood 2 towns that he said that he wasn't going to flood, to do a dam. And there's a big housing development that on public lands that the university also got a fight about that. And key people in the university are linked to a different political party than the governor, and that also affected. So the university is now always showing this in front of every program. It says the University of Guadalajara is working under protest because of the budget cut that the government of Jalisco wants to impose on the university. And they put constitutional controversy at the Supreme Court of Mexico for violating the university autonomy, because those funds were already appropriated by Congress to the university. So they didn't, even though they had just not given it, but it was already the universities, and violating the Congress authority. Since the Congress is controlled by the governor's party, well, the Congress isn't doing anything about it. And the budget was changed without any type of formal discussion or approval. It was communicated through the press during vacation time of the Congress and on a weekend. So with no discussion. The university began looking for support, and this is from an article that you see here. Specialists in different areas show support from the museum and the Supreme Court. So we had, and I'm very thankful for those professors, researchers, authorities at the University of Wisconsin-Madison that know the project and supported us. People like Jonathan Patz, like Paul Robbins, like Lori Dupree, like Alberto Vargas, and like William Cronon and many others that in a letter that was written jointly by many friends that and collaborators that know the project, they put their name on the letter to the governor and to the Supreme Court and to the Congress, and so well, there were many people like Julia Martin Lefebvre, she was the director of IUCN, president of IUCN, is now director of the Tyler Award. Jose Sarucan, Julia Carabias, who was minister, 4 different ministers from 3 different parties, ex-minister of economy, environment, and agriculture of Mexico, signed on supporting the museum. And then the university, there was the Commission of Human Rights in the state put a controversial. ¿Qué hora es? Okay. And so, so there was another controversial constitutional controversy by the Commission of Human Rights, and the National Commission of Human Rights of Mexico put in an Amicus Curiae, friends of the court, supporting the museum. I'll explain now. And then the group of experts also put an Amicus Curiae. This is what I'm showing here, it's not to read it, is what the National Commission of Human Rights, and in essence, they said the same thing. Violation of the university autonomy is one, violation of the Congress authority is another, but they picked up on something else. They said, and that's why I showed you the museum before, because of the characteristics that this museum has, and because of the way human rights work in progress, that you don't do them like that, but you have to progress to move them. In essence, then you're also violating the human right to education, the human right to a clean environment, to a healthy environment, and the human right to culture. And so there have been marches, over 350,000 signatures, marches every week. And you can see at the bottom there, the union and the student union, this is the museum, they wrote that, here we construct the Museum of Environmental Science. The governor, Enrique Alfaro, wants to destroy it, do not allow it. So that's what's on the museum walls right now, showing every day. It's an ugly fight. And so in essence, what the Supreme Court said, the university, your identity, institutional identity, does not allow you to do a constitutional controversy. Commission of Human Rights, it's really not your problem, so we're not accepting it. The vote, it was a split vote in the Supreme Court, but the university put in an amparo, which means it sued the government. So that's going to work up to the Supreme Court, but probably in 3 to 5 years. So the Supreme Court did not analyze the problem. They just didn't accept it. And now they'll have to wait till it gets to them from the lower courts. And so, but basically, so there won't be much money coming from the government, but our General Chancellor, Ricardo Villaseñor, who came to Wisconsin, he says, the Museum of Environmental Sciences will be built with, without, or in spite of the governor, Enrique Alfaro. And that's the university's position right now. Now, this has brought out human rights discussion at a level that I had never brought or discussed before. And this becomes very important if we know, and all I'm showing you here is how important, how society trusts museums in all societies, much more than schools, more than church, in some cases, more than the newspaper, much of the news. That's what I'm showing here. Aquarium, History Museum, 77%, Natural History Museum, NGO 60%, federal agencies 48, 66% daily newspapers. The role of museums is extremely important, extremely valuable. We have a big responsibility on our shoulders, and we have a big opportunity too that we have to use. Now, if you're following, there's a big fight that has been going on for a few years at the International Council of Museums over what is a museum, the definition of a museum. And in essence, the present definition is a museum is a nonprofit permanent institution in the service of society and development, open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purpose of education, study, and enjoyment. And then a committee put out the new one that was going to be voted on, but the ICOM meeting blew up, even the president resigned. And the new one was, museums are democratizing, inclusive, and polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue about the past and the futures, acknowledging and addressing the conflicts and challenges of the present. They hold artifacts and specimens in trust for society, safeguard diverse memories for future generations, and guarantee equal rights and equal access to heritage for all people. Museums are not for profit. They are participatory and transparent and work in active partnership with and for diverse communities to collect, preserve, research, interpret, exhibit, and enhance understandings of the world, aiming to contribute to human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. So that shows where the museum world is moving. Now, the ICOM, the committee of ICOM. But that blew up. No, but they didn't want to, traditional museum people didn't want it. So now if you go to the ICOM page, I'm not going to bother you with it. They're voting now. In the world, the museum world is now voting between 5 different proposals, because this one, it wasn't rejected. It wasn't even discussed because of the fight that they had. And that, but I wanted to show you this because you can see the importance of social justice now in the definition of all museums, whether it's a museum of modern art or it's a museum of toothbrushes. That's what's being linked. And so Henry McGee, who signed also the letter supporting, he has 2 works, Museums and Human Rights and Museum and Sustainable Development Goals. And in essence, where you're talking about the environment, you know, like you can't change climate change. You can't separate climate change from migration, for example, and forced migration, even if it's not war, it's war with the climate. So we're dealing with this in the museum and taking it to new areas. According to McGee, these are all the different human rights that are relevant to museums. Now, I don't know exactly how he chose them, but again, this is available online. But what we did is we started looking in a more systematic way at human rights. So the first thing is we recognize that there are 3 generations of human rights. The first generation, civil and political. In essence, those are negative rights. You can't stop them. Then we have the second generation, economic, social, and cultural. These are positive rights. And then we have third generation rights that are collective. And this is where you have rights for a clean and healthy environment, et cetera. And then using the human rights indicators of the universal of the United Nations, understanding that they are universal, inalienable, interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible. Those are what Harari calls shared fantasies, right? We created human rights. They didn't exist in a vacuum. We, just like, you know, we created Volkswagen and Twitter or Mexico or Spain. These are constructs that people create, but they're not reality. And now we have a problem in Ukraine with Russia, but you know, I like Harari's picture when he shows all the people, all the leaders of the Soviet Union, and they said countries are fantasies, and that can be shown here. When their pen touched the paper, the Soviet Union disappeared. So the most powerful country in the world disappeared upon pens touching the paper. And so, but human rights are something that have allowed us, and like I said, these fantasies are what changes the world. So then we look at the categories of the indicators to see how we would analyze the work that we do in the museum. So there are structural indicators, which in essence means that you created something to move forward the human right. There are process indicators, that means what you're doing, that you're moving along. And then there are outcome indicators that in essence is, are you doing something or not? Are you ultimately achieving something, I meant to say. And then there are indicators that are cross-cutting amongst all three. I think it's useful to look at the sentences because they show what they are. So here it says, the committee urges the state, this is a recommendation, party, to ensure implementation of the law on sexual and reproductive health. That's a structural indicator. You make a law in all provinces and guarantee affordable access to everyone, especially adolescents, to comprehensive sexual and reproductive health education and services. That's the process in which you are giving services with a view, inter alia, of addressing high maternal mortality rates. That is the outcome, lowering the maternal mortality rate. And I'm not going to read the other one, but it's in essence the same. Establish concrete targets on discrimination, that's structural. Undertake awareness raising campaign, that's the process. And increase women's participation at all levels, that is the outcome. So we can analyze them that way. And from a researcher here at the UW-Madison, Noah Feinstein, when we start thinking, remember I said wishful thinking at the beginning, and that's something, early on I was told, don't confuse what you want to do with what you really are doing and what you think you're doing. Those are three different things. And Noah says, the bitter reality is that science museums almost certainly make inequities worse. This is a logical consequence of the fact that science museums disproportionately serve the same demographic groups who have access to well-funded school, well-trained teachers, and all manner of other science enrichment resources. Until and unless this changes, science museums will continue to be part of a vicious cycle with unequal distribution of today's resources, compounds the injuries and inequalities of the past. And museums are one of the most important tools for strengthening democracy. And museums are the way to reach that sector of society that was not able to get a formal education or that does not have a pattern of reading or obtaining information in certain ways. So the human right of information is fundamental, but if museums work from an elitist point of view, then they won't cover that unique niche that they could fill. And that's one of the things that we're trying to analyze. So finally, and this is the end of the talk, this is what we did. In essence, what we have here, and I'm not going to go through it, but these are all what I showed you in the functional objectives of the university and of the museum. So we have outreach and communication, research, and teaching. And these are the activities that were pertinent. We have more, but they weren't pertinent to human rights. And then we have both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Constitution of Mexico and the rights that come in the Constitution of Mexico. And well, both of them have the right to education. So that we mix together here. Not all our activities have to do with the right of education, but then we have liberty of opinion and expression, meeting and organizing and associating in a peaceful way. And then we have social, cultural, economics, and dignity rights, and each one has the article. And then we taking part on the cultural life of your society and in the arts, that's another one, and 2.9 with respect of being a participant in your community and to live and develop your personality. And on the politics, to health, to a healthy environment, to food, adequate nutrition, and to access to information in an opportune and important way. So that's what we're analyzing now in terms of how our work really achieves that, either at the structural process or outcome level. And Santana, that's